Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's coffee talk. Thanks to those of you who joined our show before the show with Paul, Steve, and I talking about the weather. We are very pleased to have you today. My name is Sean O'Brien, the president of Quick Rate, and I'm going to quickly introduce the stars of the show today here. Steve Huntington, who many of you know from our previous coffee talks. Steve, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. As Sean mentioned, I'm Steve Huntington, Director of Analytics here at Quick Rate and Quick Analytics. I spent my entire career working with credit unions and community banks on all aspects from strategic planning and capital planning to valuation work and advisory and model design and maintenance. And I've been working with Sean here for a little over a decade now, developing the tools that we'll talk about today.
Thank you, Steve. And we're welcoming back Paul Allen. Paul is, we've had a number of requests inbound lately just around kind of the mechanics of year end here. So we thought Paul was the perfect friend to have come back and join us. So Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, Sean, thank you for having me. As it says on the slide, I'm a shareholder at Saltmarsh, Cleveland and Gunn. We're about a 78-year-old firm that is in Florida and Tennessee, but we get the opportunity to work with financial institutions all over the country, and that's our biggest industry expertise. So love working with financial institutions and feeling your pain as you go through CECL, and especially in these unusual economic times. So happy to join you and hope I can help out just a little bit. So
I'm sure you will, and thank you very much for joining us today, Paul. Here, just again, a little bit more background on Paul and his firm, and certainly encourage all of you to reach out to him with any questions or if you're looking for a great auditor. Okay, so our format's still the same. We think it's worked throughout the year. If you have questions, submit those please through the Q&A or through the chat. We'll monitor those as we move through the presentation. Again, heavily focused today, just kind of on some of the to-do list, checklist items as we get closer to year end. And then Steve's going to touch on just some of the enhancements that we continue to make to the CECLSolver, certainly based on feedback we're receiving from you, our users. So without further ado, we're going to talk about some of the hot topics, particularly around some of the day one stuff, and I'm going to turn that piece over to Paul. Paul?
Thank you, Sean. I know that you and Steve are getting a lot of the same questions we're getting, and as folks move into January 1st and move into CECL, there's a lot of discussion about what we call the day one activities, which is the first day of a new accounting pronouncement. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. We also get a lot of questions about, do I need to have a policy about how I calculate the reserve under CECL? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, the CECL calculation is in fact a model. We use models all around the institution, but we're going to talk a little bit about model validation, or how we make sure that the calculation itself is working as we expect and will survive, an auditor or an examiner taking a look at it. So first and foremost, I want to make clear that you do not have to plan on spending a 57-hour day on January 1st. I'm just kidding, but there's naturally a lot of anxiety about how we actually step into the new year with CECL, but I want to just make sure that you understand no one expects you to do all of this in one day, even though we use that day one phrase within the accounting pronouncement. It simply means that's the first day of a new accounting pronouncement. So hopefully January 1st will be the day after you celebrate the new year. I want you to sleep in a little bit, have a cup of coffee, take a walk, relax, count your blessings, etc. And first and foremost, you need to close out your fiscal year. So most financial institutions, an awful lot of the financial institution industry has a 12/31 year end. So we're assuming that you're closing out 12/31. You have to do that so that we can move into the CECL calculation. So the first thing you have to do is close out and do your regular incurred loss calculation. just like you would always do for each quarter end, and you've probably already been running at least one quarterly parallel. So a lot of institutions have run 331, 630, and 930. So you do need to run your regular calculation, and then you need to run a parallel. You're going to compare the results of those two, and the difference between the required reserve under the current incurred method for 12/31 and the new CECL method on January 1st, that difference is not going to go through income statement. It's going to go to capital, to equity in essence. And so the first process you'll do is take a breath, have a cup of coffee, close out your year end, do the model or the reserve calculation under incurred, then take that data, run it under the CECL, and look at that difference. I encourage you to look at that difference and talk among the management group, make sure that management is all on the same side in agreement. I would talk with your external auditors about that. I would expect perhaps that you might, during the month of January, get a call from your primary regulator saying, so what was the difference? Is it no difference? Is it a big difference? What is it? So just be ready to go. You might also be thinking about whatever your reserve to loan calculation is probably driving your budget assumption for 2023. So if there's a big change in your reserve requirement, you might want to rethink your budget that you might have already talked to or had your board and be ready to go in. And then when you get to that difference, then that difference once again is going to go to equity or capital as opposed to through the income statement. So that's kind of a big change. Each quarter, sometimes under the incurred method, we had changes in our reserve requirement, and we would book a provision to loan loss, a debit to expense, and a credit to the reserve. Well, now any entry that would have gone to the income statement will go to equity instead. Sean, what do you think? You think everyone is just ready to go on January 1st? I hear a lot of anxiety, and I'm hoping that this will be encouraging, that we will get through this. We have the month of January to get our call report ready to go. And really the first time we actually issue any financials with that information, and it will be the 331 call report. So hopefully that's encouraging.
I think it is encouraging, Paul. I think it's increased, or it's even more encouraging having it come from you, someone who's focused on this rather than simply us. And so we appreciate that. But I do think it is worth re-emphasizing that, again, you are going to close out 12/31. You're going to kind of run through your normal process. Don't feel overwhelmed that you have to knock all of this out here in the first day or two. You've got plenty of time. And so I appreciate you kind of laying this out here for everybody. We will make these slides and a link to today's presentation available to everyone who attends, and even if you didn't attend. And so you'll have this as a reference, to again, just try to, ease any anxiety you might have just about this accounting change.
And Sean, we do get occasionally a question about, well, when do I actually book that entry? No one's expecting you to book that entry on January 1st, as a matter of fact. So,
yeah.
You don't normally do your incurred reserve calculation until, a week or two after year end when you get all the information. So we're expecting that day one, what we call the day one calculation, and that adjustment would be backdated in your general ledger. So again, just want to calm everybody down. No one's expecting you to do everything on January 1st itself. We just use that day one as the first day of the new accounting methodology.
Fantastic. And so then probably again near the top of the list of questions we're receiving at the moment. And again, just a reminder, we are working on some templates for you. We'll have those available by the end of the year. Part of our conversations have been with Paul about what, kind of things to consider when looking at your policy, and even the template we're trying to help and assist design with. And in the course of that conversation, Paul had, I thought, really practical and important points. And so again, I've asked him to just kind of discuss some of the things that he thinks are important for you to consider, and just not trying to do too much with your policy. And so again, I'll turn this over to Paul to let him talk about, maybe some best practices when it comes to policies.
Well, I think that, it's fairly common in our industry to have a policy statement that talks about the allowance calculation. that provides board guidance and so forth. When we first started, when I was 16, Sean started talking about CECL, and I'm teasing. We've been talking about it for a long time. You know, there's a natural kind of inclination that we'll start our policy and have a long narrative about what CECL is, kind of copy the whole standard, put it into policy. I just want to encourage you, you don't need to do that. We don't need to put the authoritative literature in the policy. If you want to have a paragraph that just has a little bit of a background, what is important in your policy is that you need to say the credit union has adopted the new pronouncement effective X date. For most of you, that'll be January 1st. Under that guidance, you have adopted this approach. If you're going to use the warm approach, for example, you could, in the guidance, there's a variety of approaches you can have. You don't have to put in your policy all the choices you could have made. You simply need to say that the board has approved that this is your approach. So very important there. I think it's important in your policy that the board would approve the model vendor or the approach you're taking. So those are in those first items there. But in any policy, and especially in ones using a model, it's very important to make sure that we say who's responsible, who at the institution is going to run the model, who's going to provide oversight, whether that's the board, supervisory committee, audit committee, risk committee, who's looking over that, who has access to the model, how frequently you're going to run the model. For most of you, it will be quarterly, but theoretically, you could run it monthly if you wanted to, but most people probably run quarterly. But the board should say, we want it run quarterly. And so that process, how that, who reports to what, whether it goes to the full board or a subcommittee of the board. And then in any model, and including in CECL, about 50% of the information in the model is actual data and about 50% is assumptions. So assumptions are very, very important. So we need in the policy to say who will determine assumptions and how will they be approved and how will that be monitored periodically. So theoretically, in almost all our models, we have policies that say, for example, these are the key assumptions. And usually on an annual basis, the board reviews the key assumptions and approves them. So Sean, certainly you can have a 15-page or 20-page policy. My style, I'd rather start with about a 3-page policy, has the basic information about what the institution's going to do, who's going to supervise it, who's going to have oversight. We can always naturally, as we go forward, get the policy longer and longer as examiners and others come in and say, you ought to talk about this or that. We can always add to it, but I just want to encourage everyone, you don't have to put all of the CECL guidance as an educational tool in your policy. You can simply refer to the existing guidance rather than put it all in there.
That's fantastic. And certainly you and I are like mind that, you know, again, not trying to overcomplicate anything. So again, we certainly appreciate the points to consider here today, the feedback you gave us on the template we are doing. And I think important to note again, as we put in here that, you know, this is something you don't have done by January 1st, where we can get it done and finalized in the first quarter. So we are working on ours. And so we'll give you some templates to make your own, but, you know, hopefully, you know, we'll in the same way incorporate these components that Paul's listed out here for you today. A couple of questions have come in really for the first topic that we touched on just on the day one, is the first one being, if you operate on a fiscal year, do you have to adopt and book CECL in January?
First of all, I would like to encourage you to check with your auditors and your make sure, because that's an accounting opinion. I don't want to give accounting opinions, but generally speaking, you adopt accounting pronouncements on the first of your fiscal year. So typically that's what you would normally do. All accounting pronouncements pretty much are usually adopted on the first day of a fiscal year.
Perfect. The second question is the option to spread out the initial change a one-time adjustment or spread out quarterly for the next 3 years? Can you choose a time frame less than 3 years to spread it out, such as 1 or 2 year?
So there's a difference between regulatory accounting and GAAP accounting, right? So in GAAP accounting, we're going to book the difference right now. But for regulatory call report purposes, the regulators have given us some options to spread that in for purposes of regulatory accounting over periods of time. And so you can follow the regulatory guideline there. Generally speaking, you can choose a shorter transition period of time than is allowed under regulatory. That is typical with most regulatory options like that. They allow you some period of time to minimize the impact on capital. So typically it's okay to take it on day one if you can withstand that and it doesn't affect your capital ratios. But for most people, they will spread it over the regulatory time allowed. But again, that's for call report purposes.
Fantastic. The next question, I think, Steve, is really more for you and me. If we start on January 1, our ending date range would be 9/30/22, since that is the latest call report data that's in Quick Analytics. Is this correct? Well, that is the latest data that we've posted there for you. However, if you'll know your 12/31 numbers, as Paul mentioned, right? You would be normally filing your call report. You can take those numbers that you'll be using for the 12/31 call report, and in our tool, you can override that column with those numbers. So we won't have posted those till the day after you file, but you can certainly update the tool to incorporate your 12/31 balances. Steve, anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, if you're doing, like I said, if you're doing that calculation right at the beginning of January, we won't have the 12/31 data. However, if you're spending your first couple of weeks in January, as Paul was mentioning, focusing on your 12/31 calculations under the incurred loss methodology, then by the time you're really kind of finalizing that initial CECL calculation and then comparing it to that 12/31 incurred loss calculation, you may, at the end, right at the end of January, you'll be getting in our tool all that updated 12/31 peer data and industry data. So the question really becomes, do you have to do that final, kind of locked in CECL calculation for your day one adjustment before you get 12/31 data at the end of January, or can you estimate it and then at the end of January, beginning of February, get that data, finalize it then, and then backdate that transition calculation or that day one calculation to be accurate, including 12/31 data. Paul?
And the answer to that is yes, you have flexibility with respect to how long. Once again, we're calling it day one because it's the day one effect that we're calculating, but you have time to close out your books and prepare that calculation. And theoretically, you have the first quarter to do that. Now, your board and your primary regulator may be wanting information a lot quicker than that, but it is fairly typical that our normal 12/31 closeout will occur somewhere over the month of January, right? We're generally shooting to have it done at the end of January for that call report that's due. But so you have some time to do that calculation all the way into the first quarter. And Sean, going back to the policy, we would sort of expect that probably when you go to the board with your 3/31 draft numbers ready for the call report, you're probably going to ask them to approve the policy at that time. So that would be kind of a natural period of time that in the first quarter you could do that. You could also check with your board and your auditors and say, I'd like to book my day one calculation based on 9/30 information. And if you can justify that you don't think the balance sheet components will change very significantly, that may be okay within materiality that you would use the previous quarter. But once again, that's sensitive to your board and sensitive to your auditors as well. So there is quite a bit of flexibility in coming up with that calculation, but you do have time. I do want everybody to realize that January 1st is going to be a very long day if we have to accumulate a month or two of work in one day. That's pretty unrealistic. Nobody expected that. Again, day one, that term is an accounting term dealing with how we capture the impact. but not when we capture the impact.
And that's a great point. And again, just a reminder, you will have your 1231 numbers to prepare your 1231 call report. Those are the same balances that are going to go into the CECLSolver. You can manually update our tool with those balances. So if you have questions on that, certainly reach out to David or Jason, and we can get you, situated with that. The next question is kind of a follow-up as well, and there's two here. For the 1231-22 call report, would I still be using the current incurred method and then use the new CECL method for the first time in the 331 call report? So
that is exactly correct. The only difference is that when you do the 331 when you do your day one calculation, you're using 1231 balances because those balances won't change between 1231 and 1/1. So 1231 balances will be the proxy or the opening balance sheet for that. But we still have to do the call report as of 1231 under the current accounting gap, and that's in the incurred method for 1231. We just have to do a separate calculation using the same dollars in terms of the balance sheet, but under the new methodology, and then compare those two.
And then going back to the question about the day one change and the gap in regulatory accounting, what if there's a large positive transfer?
Large positive transfer meaning a much higher amount or a much lower?
Well, I was kind of taking it maybe that they're going to pull money out of the reserve, maybe?
Yeah, it is possible that your
equity.
Yeah, it's possible that your incurred reserve, it would, might calculate higher than your CECL. I think everyone kind of assumes that the CECL calculation will be at or above your incurred. But just like you would adjust any quarterly allowance calculation, you would normally debit provision and credit reserve, or debit the reserve to reduce it and credit the provision. The entry to the expense account will go to capital instead of through the income statement. So so the big change is that each quarter end, we adjust our reserves. We typically go through the income statement for any increase or decrease. In this case, it's going through capital. But again, it is possible. I will just warn anyone, if you see a huge reduction in the CECL requirement, I'd be very careful, maybe go get a cup of coffee, walk around the block and come back and look at it again. I think, the industry and regulators are assuming that CECL calculation will be higher because we're booking a reserve over the life of the loan rather than a shorter period of time under the incurred method. So generally speaking, you'd expect your reserve calculation to go up.
And so then Bob's talking about an increase in equity. So Bob, if we didn't fully answer that, just reach out to us afterwards and we'll try to make sure we got you addressed, your question addressed appropriately. Okay, and so I thought you made a good point there too, Paul, that the expectation, you would think for a lot of institutions will be that they, are at or a slightly larger, provision, going forward. But it's certainly not uncommon that you would expect that the credit union's reserve balance to be kind of similar to what they have today in the incurred loss.
Yeah, I think actually across both credit unions and community banks, when we started talking about CECL, we were coming out of some really bad economic conditions, and we thought, oh my gosh, we're going to have huge reserves under CECL. Over the last 5 years or so, we've had very, very good credit metrics, and we haven't had the charge-offs or losses. So, generally speaking, we're expecting that the reserve calculation is not going to have a big difference. The charge-offs that we are seeing in nationally in the financial institution industry right now are mostly in automotive loans or credit cards. And so those portfolios have some credit metrics to think about historical loss. But an awful lot of the rest of our loan portfolio just doesn't have enough historical during the average life period that we would be looking back.
Great. Fantastic. So then the final thing that, certainly has come up, periodically, or I should say consistently, is around just, validation and understanding, responsibilities here. And again, I think parenthetically, we put in here that this is again, something you have time to take care of. In our CECL resources button on the summary page, we do have our SOC 1. But again, I thought with Paul here, he would be able to share some tips and just, points to consider when you're thinking about, validation. Paul?
Sure. Sean, the next couple of slides, as a matter of fact, are really takeaways for folks. I encourage you to, think about this and use this not only for the CECL model, but in all the models we use in the institution. We have interest rate risk models, we have credit risk models, and so forth. So we're always sort of stepping back and saying, what are the major components? Well, data integrity. Is the right data going into the model? Is it our data? Is it mapped correctly? In other words, are we calling adjustable loans? Are we got those mixed with fixed? Are we got all the right loan fields? Are they going in correctly? So management has a responsibility to make sure that the model vendor is getting the right data and that you explain, what are the fields in your loan trial balance and other records so that they can map it correctly. And then we have as much assumption information as we have data pretty much in the model. So are the assumptions correct? By the way, all models have default assumptions built in, or else they can't show you an example of the model. So all the assumptions have to be approved and thought about. Are they appropriate for your institution? And then are those the assumptions actually in the model? Then we come to the math part, the model process. When we put 2 + 2 in the model, does it always equal 4? Well, all the model vendors provide some kind of a SOC report that says, yes, if we put sample data and sample assumptions, the math works. So that's up to the vendor to provide. Management just needs to make sure that they're asking for that report and they understand that report and they're reading that report. The reason that the validation as a concept is so important is we want to make sure that somebody independent, not the person running the model, but somebody independent that has enough knowledge is actually checking to make sure that it's reasonable, that the inputs are correct, how it's working and so forth. Because that last point, the integrity of that model is what's driving our allowance calculation. And the allowance calculation is always a material component of our financial statements. So our financial statements are as good or bad as the controls around that calculation. And so just wanted to point those out, again, in that 3 major aspects. Management's on the hook for the first 2. Make sure that they're getting the right assumptions and the right data to the vendor. The vendor gives you a SOC report. Management needs to make sure they're getting it and reading it, making sure they understand it. But those are the basic things. And Sean, those are kind of takeaways because you can put that pretty much in any model used in the institution.
Which I think is fantastic, and certainly appreciate you sharing that with our attendees here today, because it is a great resource to have. And follow-up slide then is just, to that point, just a few additional controls and responsibilities that, for the institution to think about. Anything to add here, Paul?
No, I encourage everyone to steal this slide and use it as much as they want, because those internal controls on models are true of any model. So, who has access to it, who can control it, who can change the way it works, who can, type over the assumptions and so forth. So those things are important of all models. And then at the bottom, just the responsibilities. So that goes back to our policy. Our policy has to kind of make sure that it touches these high points. Who's responsible? Is it a board, supervisory committee, audit committee? Who's going to be monitoring and providing oversight to the folks at the institution? Make sure that there's a periodic back test. In other words, we'll look at what was projected for a future period, and we'll look at the actual and see how close we are. And then making sure that there is some periodically checking the math, checking the mapping, tracing amounts in, and making sure that it's all working and so forth. So those are the responsibilities. And again, those kind of tie, Sean, back to what we think should be in a policy.
Yep, absolutely. An interesting question. Is model validation acceptable by other credit union CFOs, for example, rather than a firm or a vendor?
Yes, in theory, you could, anybody that is sufficiently knowledgeable and independent of the calculation could do that. I do have a financial institution where there's several, it happens to be a bank, but there's several community banks under a holding company. And some of the CFOs serve as doing validation on others. The only thing I would ask is making sure that the person actually has sufficient understanding of what you're trying to do so that they can actually challenge, realistically challenge the assumption. And then somehow they'd have to be able to put that in writing so that that report of validation would actually go to your oversight committee, whether it be the board or the supervisory committee or a risk committee. So again, most CFOs are pretty busy already with things on their plate. And so it may be an attractive concept, but hard to actually pull off, in terms of the tyranny of the immediate, right? Just too much things going on.
Yeah, but that's a great answer and a great question. So thank you for submitting that. All right. So again, just a little bit more here on best practices and key points around the SOC report. So here again, Paul, anything to add beyond the slides?
No, I just wanted to help the CFOs understand that when you do get those SOC reports, we do routinely expect that they're not going to be done as of yesterday. In other words, they're usually done on an annual or periodic basis. It's up to you to use your judgment to decide when it's too old and there's too long a period of time. Secondly, that SOC report is using example data and example assumptions. It's not your data. So it's being done that every time you put 2 + 2 in, it equals 4, but you still have to make sure that your data and your assumptions go in. And there may be some comments in that report that you need to pay attention to that deal with making sure the vendor doesn't have open doors and leave their computer out in the sidewalk and anybody can change anything they want anytime. But they're also
I can confirm we don't do that.
Yeah, but in other words, in the same way, you have to make sure that you have user controls to identify that you are limiting access within your institution. And then this last point, Sean, it'll never happen with your company, but we have seen core processors that, gave the SOC report away the first couple of years, and then all of a sudden, well, if you want that, it's an extra $1,000 or whatever. So I would make sure that I'm asking, how do I get the SOC report? Is it available to me? Is it free? Will it always be free? Or, what's the charge for it and so forth? So occasionally. And then the last one is, as with all models or bond accounting reports, we do periodically want to run them against another source and check for reasonableness. And I just mentioned in there, you can use the scale model, you can use different models, industry models and so forth. We're not expecting them to be exactly the same result, but we're expecting that you should be able to explain or that they're reasonable. For example, if you run with your data and then you compare it with a model that uses completely industry data, you could say, well, the industry has very little auto loans. I have a lot of auto loans, or I don't have any credit card, so I can eliminate that. So you can kind of make a distinction between your product mix and also your geographic markets that you serve, because economic conditions would be different. So once again, Sean, those are kind of applicable to all kinds of SOC reports, and just helpful to allow people to get a little bit of calm and reduce the anxiety about what do I do when I get that SOC report.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Paul. And again, thank you very much for sharing this, because again, we will share this presentation with everybody. And so this is just a great checklist of things for everybody to consider. So, really a special thanks to Paul for putting this together for all of us today. To that end, regarding our SOC report, so it is found again in the blue resources button. We just did our annual update, but here on the next couple of slides, we're going to start to talk about, after we finish this slide, some of the enhancements we've made around being able to kind of independently validate, the data within the CECLSolver. So, Paul, any final comments here on this particular slide?
No, on this one, it's really it's a takeaway for the folks on the call. Just when we do model validation reports and reviews, these are some of the things that are the most common problems that you might want to be thinking about and so forth. So just wanted to give you an expectation when you do have your CECL model validation, what might be some of the things that they're looking at. So probably more important to spend the time, make sure that you have time to talk about the changes and updates to the CECLSolver. This is a takeaway.
Great, fantastic. Thanks again, Paul. And so to that end, as we've mentioned in our anticipation for next year is, I think our focus this year was getting everybody here to the finish line to get to the transition. And then, we suspect and are already seeing it is that 2023, as we get more familiar with the new standard and our CECLSolver, just inquiries or questions on how to be maybe more specific, right? We talked a lot throughout the year about precision versus accuracy. And I think as everyone gains more confidence and comfort with how this is all working, we've gotten additional questions. And a lot of those have been revolved around just calculating the warm. It's been around the Q factors. And so we have, and I should say Steve has, really kind of dove into some of these specifically and built some additional tools and resources. And so we're going to touch on a few of those here with the remainder of the presentation today. So first up, there is a new user guide for those of you who haven't seen that. We've talked about it in some of the previous coffee talks, but it's in the link. Steve did a great job of it, not only incorporating all of the new functionality, but also included screenshots so you can really go step by step in what's necessary to run the CECLSolver. Next up that I'm going to turn it over to Steve is around the warm estimator. And again, Steve, I'll go ahead and just stop sharing and give the con here to you, and you can take over.
Sure. Give me just a second to share the appropriate screen here. We can let me know when that's popped up.
I can see it.
Excellent. So the first thing we do want to kind of go over just briefly, at least, is the warm estimator tool, the Excel-based warm estimator tool. This is a kind of an enhanced version or a little bit more granular version of that tool, which allows you to take into account amortization in a couple different ways if you so choose. The existing warm estimator tool that we've always had up on the site is still acceptable, and it's still something you can certainly keep using if you like the way it works. But we got a lot of questions from a lot of credit unions, and the more we dug into it, and that we wanted to give some other alternatives or some other options for credit unions, especially credit unions that wanted to take a little bit more of an aggressive approach. The existing warm estimator tool doesn't need a whole lot of data and is a little bit more conservative in its in its outlook. Whereas the updated one you see here, or the enhanced one you see here, still has all the exact same calculations you've always had before, which is this data up here, where we're just taking balance and maturity date information, calculating an unadjusted weighted average remaining maturity from that, and then affecting that with some sort of an annual prepayment rate estimate to get a prepayment adjusted warm. That's still certainly a defensible approach, and will give you a relatively on the higher end of the warms and a more conservative calculation as a result of that for your CECL reserves. The new alternative, or the new choices, are if you wanted to also take into account amortization on a straight line basis just at the portfolio level. We've designed another kind of add-on to the tool here that will then take this data that we've already plugged in, or you've already plugged in at the loan level, and then do an updated warm, also taking into account straight line amortization of that portfolio. Now, as an alternative to that, we also have a more granular approach. If you wanted to go into your loan level data and make individual decisions about amortization versus interest only or non-amortizing loans at the loan level, or if you wanted to plug in information about anticipated balloon payments or contractual balloon payments at maturity for the loan, you can actually plug that data here in the loan level, and it will recalculate the amortization schedule here and give you a more detailed or more granular granular amortization adjusted WARM as well. So you see when these two approaches are getting at the same concept, this one just allows you some more loan level assumptions that you can tweak. And this one is a little bit more straightforward portfolio based. But both of them are going to result in a lower, more aggressive WARM calculation than the initial one, which just takes into account prepayments and not a lot of different amortization assumptions as well. The other enhancement to this tool.
And Steve, I just want to reemphasize it, and you made the comment, but I just want to say it out loud again. Right, it's perfectly acceptable to continue to use the tool we've had all along, right? Our initial approach was to be as conservative as we possibly can. And when you think about WARMs, the longer the WARM, the more conservative it's going to be, right? No prepayment assumption is going to create a longer WARM. Almost by definition, then it's going to capture potentially more historical losses. So our design was to be more conservative, but naturally now with hundreds of credit unions using the tool, we certainly have, a spectrum of users, and certainly some are looking to have, a shorter WARM. And so again, this was, the iterations of having those types of conversations and the work that Steve did to put it together. But all of them are perfectly acceptable. It's really your choice of support of how you want to use them.
Certainly. And the other additional detail and information that's in this version of the tool comes from the NCUA itself, right? It was relatively recently that the NCUA put a good bit of work into doing some research, gathering loan level data from smaller credit unions around the entire country in order to give some guidance on prepayment assumptions and WARM calculations for purposes of pretty much for purposes of CECL. And this is a result of that. There's some notes down here saying where this is coming from. But what they did was they took that loan level data from credit unions around the country and calculated some industry standard prepayment rates at the segment level, and then did some WARM calculations. So some actual prepayment and amortization adjusted WARM calculations for call report segments of the portfolio. So this becomes a great starting point for doing your WARM calculations. If you just started using our tool and you're not getting good loan level WARM calculations from another provider, and you're not using us to do that either, if you just want to plug in some quote industry standards to get the ball rolling, this is a great place to start with these WARM calculations. So what we've done here is we've integrated these prepayment rates from the NCUA into our tool. So instead of the default prepayment rate for our WARM estimator just being 5 or 10% across the board, which is kind of a standard, conservative value, we're using by default, at least, the values coming directly from the NCUA. So that's certainly an improvement based upon more real world data available to us directly from your regulator. And now we also have sort of an updated summary page. So we just wanted to present you with some more options for the WARM. So here is the way the WARM has been calculated on our tool. Have suggested alternative if you're trying to get those WARMs down, that's based upon amortization at portfolio level calculation. And this would be for literally a loan level amortization calculation if you wanted to go in and cut and paste your own amortization tables, or even just put in some assumptions about balloon payments. These are the WARM values coming directly from the NCUA, and these are the prepayment assumptions coming directly from the NCUA guidance. So you can, we plug in the loan level data, or you come to this summary page, you look at these alternatives for WARM calculations and the guidance, and determine what you think the ultimate most appropriate one to use. Those are the values that you kind of type in here, then you save this file, and then these values you would transfer into your tool, and then you're off and running with the WARM. So we certainly think that gives you some more options and some more defense of whatever you think is most appropriate for the WARM calculations, which are, since they're such a critical component and input into the tool, right? I mean, at its heart, CECL is estimating losses over the remaining lives of the asset. So obviously, biggest assumption ever is what is the remaining lives of the asset.
Steve, we had a question come in on the NCUA data. I suspect this is not available yet, but the question was, is the NCUA database information on region as well?
No, nope. It is based upon They like to be short on the footnote details because then it gets into the more deep they get into the weeds. I think the more people they're going to have dealing with this, and I don't think they really want to necessarily put a bunch of resources towards supporting it, which doesn't surprise us. But so it just says that they employed external sources and resources, so they hired some other consulting firms, and they use their own internal loan level data that they have access to, obviously. And they use credit unions under 100 million in assets. So all of this NCUA data is based upon some population of credit unions under 100 million in assets, whether it's all 3,000 of them in the United States or a sample of 100 of them. We don't know, and I don't know if we'll ever know. But they are going to be updating it on a quarterly basis. So our estimator tool, the default values and the NCUA guidance here will be updated on a quarterly basis. And it says pretty much, this is how they said, that they did this estimated using loan level performance data obtained from a peer set of credit unions, as well as market-based prepayment data, et cetera, using prepayment studies performed for credit unions in the peer set, as well as market data from credit unions under 100 million in assets. So not a huge amount of data on exactly what the population is. I don't think they'll ever share the details on how exactly they did the math and all the relevant data. But since it's coming directly from the NCUA, I doubt they'll be asking you to validate that.
Right. And I think, again, it's just a good reminder that, the NCUA has been pretty clear that their initial expectation for the credit unions is simply get transition. And it's these types of things that, again, I think will evolve over time, getting maybe more specific or more granular. But I think, they were pretty clear to us when we spoke to Allison Clark before she retired, that their expectation around CECL is that this first go around, this first year, they just want to make sure that the credit unions is transition, and that was really going to be their focus, not so much digging too deep into all the aspects of it just yet. Okay. Let's see. I'll take back the slide here for a second, Steve.
Sure.
So here's just a reminder in the slide deck of where this is all going to be located. Again, these will be found in the resources button on the CECL page. Here's again a snapshot of Steve's summary page that he's done that will be part of the Excel spreadsheet. Here is again some of that guidance that Steve's discussing with the credit unions under 100 million. Steve, anything you want to add to this slide?
Nope. This is just a snapshot of one of the source material that will be reflected identically within our Excel based tool. So you don't have to keep going over to the NCUA, digging through all their pages to get to it. Every quarter you can find it right in our tool.
Fantastic. Next up, in the spirit of validation, we felt our responsibility was obviously to provide a SOC, because that again independently validates and confirms the way, as Paul put it, I think perfectly, 2 + 2 = 4. However, we have some institutions who've asked more details around their own individual calculations. And as you know, in our CECLSolver, to spare you the probably the eyesore of hundreds and hundreds of data points on quarterly data, we show you annual numbers as it relates to charge-off information and balances, despite the fact us looking at quarterly data that you provide through your call report. As a result, Steve has gone to the extraordinary step of expanding our Excel export option to now allow you to include and see all of that data. So Steve, take it away.
Yeah, so this, if you joined us before, you've seen this sort of snapshot of just kind of how the calculations work, right? How that lifetime loss rate, which is such an important component of CECL, is calculated using our tool. If you're on the interactive tool, we show summary annual calculations in the historical detail tab. If we were to put every single data point for each quarter, that sort of page would kind of go on horizontally forever. You'd never be able to print it or export it or really get your arms around it. That page is designed to show you those long-term loss trends and balance trends so that you can get a feel for directional, right, trends and directions in loss experience so that you can then have your defense for projecting that forward. But if you were looking to try to, completely perfectly recalculate some of those historical lifetime loss rates, now at the when you're in your export options on the tool, all the way down at the bottom is a new button that says download complete historical data set, which will allow you to pretty much just get all, it looks exactly the same as it has. It just has all the quarterly values instead of just annual summary ones. And that from that data, you could recreate this spreadsheet here, which shows us exactly how the lifetime loss rate is calculated, which is looking at each of those quarterly net charge-off ratios and then adding them all up. So we're aggregating those losses over a multi-year period. So our lifetime loss rate is not an annual or annualized value. That's sometimes something people get caught up on a lot, and they say, well, we're only losing about 10 basis points a year. Why do you have 40 basis points our loss rate? Because that's a 4-year aggregate loss rate. That's not an average annual over 4 years. That's an actual 4-year total on the balance loss rate. So that's where the disconnect is, and that's where how our calculations work. Now, whether you add up all the quarterly net charge-off ratios to one aggregate one, or whether you take the annual ones and add them up, the math ends up working out pretty much the same way, but it's just how you get there. So we give you the data and the tools to get there and do additional validation on it if you need to.
Yeah, thanks.
If you had
I would say, I'm sorry, Paul, to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, Steve, you're using a 3-year warm, but if you had a loan component with 10 years, that spreadsheet would go very wide, right? So
yes, it would go very wide. Exactly. We have, if you had a 10-year warm, and of course, at this point, especially after talking about the warm estimator tool a little bit and taking into account amortization and whatnot, a 10-year warm is extremely long and highly likely to be overestimated, except for extenuating circumstances. So the further along we've gotten, the more as an industry, we've all realized these warms are not really as long as people might be thinking they are. So if you find yourself using our tool or doing warm calculations or getting them from another provider, and your warms that are taking into account prepayments and maybe amortizations are still in like the 9, 10, 11, 12-year range, I would suggest you look at them more carefully because they're probably being significantly overstated. But if it was 10 and that was accurate and that's what you want to go with, then we're literally looking at 40 quarters worth of loss, recovery, and balance data to do that lifetime calculation.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And Steve, to your point, this is probably the single biggest question we get around the calculation is just the slight variation that we have versus, taking the annual charge-off ratio and essentially multiplying it by a warm. You can actually see now
because we're using partial years too, right?
Correct.
We're doing this. If it was a 3-year warm ending September 30th, you couldn't take 2019, 20, and 21, and because that wouldn't be taking into account the last. So we're looking at the exact 3 years ending, let's say right now, September 30th. So we'll be taking the fourth quarter of 2020, all of 2021, and the first 3 quarters of 2022 and aggregating them to calculate that. So we're not taking annual ones and then kind of doing some fuzzy math to approximate it. We're getting a more accurate calculation.
Correct. That's awesome. So there's a question that came in. It's probably back to the previous slide. Has there been any discussion on using a standard look back period for all loan segments? Example, take a historical look back period of 5 years for all loan segments.
Yeah, I'll take that now that I want to hear Paul's thoughts on it as well. But that's probably more typical than our approach. Our approach in designing and developing our tool, we saw other vendors and some of the not guidance but suggested methodologies kind of pick arbitrarily, literally out of a hat, a 3, 5, or 7-year look back period for your entire portfolio. That is certainly another approach that you could take. That's not the approach that we took with our tool, because conceptually, again, since CECL is all about estimating losses over the remaining lives of the assets, one would think if you're estimating losses on a mortgage portfolio that has an average life of 7 or 8 years, you probably want to go further back in history to see how it's performed historically over a lifetime versus a construction loan that has a life of 1 year if you're going back 7 years, you're going back 7 lifetimes. You just don't need to go back that far to get a feel for how it performs over a shorter lifetime. That's why we match or marry the look back periods at the segment level to those warms. So we have all sort of custom, so to speak, or look back periods that vary by segment, whereas some other methodologies or vendors might just have a block 3, 5, or 7 years. And my question to them would be, well, that's great, but how do you justify that? Why 5 years? Why not 3? Why not 7? What is that? What, real world information is that connected to? Whereas it's, our approach, I think, is a lot more defensible. Paul?
Yeah, I think under the concept of CECL, if you have a 7-year asset, you would say the life is 7 years, so you'd want to look back 7 years to see what kind of losses in the previous cycle. And then in theory, you have discretion under GAAP to say, well, but the prior 7 years wasn't reflective of what I expect going forward, perhaps. Maybe we had COVID for 2 years, so we may want to use a different look period, or we may want to slide and use a 7-year period in a previous period of time and so forth. But theoretically, at least, the look back period would be tied to the average life. So I think as you said, as a practical expedient, some folks are just using sort of pick a look back period out of a hat. I would just warn you, you should expect to maybe get a question about, well, how did you pick the look back period when if it's very different than your average life, there's a disconnect there in terms of the concept. So if you just simply said, as a practical expedient, we're using 5-year look back period, and we don't believe it's materially different, then maybe once a year you run it with different average lives or different look back periods to prove that it doesn't make a big difference. But again, the pronouncement itself gives management a lot of discretion, but that discretion is intended to be that you can reconcile or explain why you wouldn't use sort of the obvious method.
Yeah, and I'm continuously surprised by how I've seen a lot of different versions of, when we talk about the warm method, it really isn't a method, right? There are many variations on a theme, so to speak. It's a warm-like type method, and I've seen a lot of different methodologies employed that fall under the umbrella of a warm-based method, and many of them seem to choose a sort of an arbitrary look-back period, which is the same for the entire portfolio. And we think this is just maybe a little bit more complicated, not complicated, but more difficult to design. But since we've designed it, we think it's a better approach. All that being said, we anticipate continuing to evolve the tool in the future. And one of those things that we'll be offering down the road is the ability to have even more flexibility with the look back periods. At the tool as it is today, you can, if you have a 5-year warm, you can use any 5-year period you want, but it has to be a 5-year period for the reasons we've talked about. In the future, we will be allowing you to customize the duration or length of that look back period. It would certainly involve more math, because if you have a 2-year look back period and a 5-year warm, you have to multiply something by 2.5 to get an accurate calculation. But we'll be offering some more of that, because there are certain circumstances where you don't have the data for it, right? If you're a de novo institution, or if you recently acquired another institution and you just have a historical data set, which you only a short period of which you think is relevant to your expected future losses, and a long warm, you have something you have to deal with conceptually. So we're going to continue providing more options for that as we go forward.
Yeah, and then final reminder, again, we've got those NCUA default warm guidances. So again, if you're looking for practical expedience, the NCUA did, come to your rescue here.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's see. Finally here, and I know we're getting up on our hour here. So, again, we did put out the Q factor matrix. Steve, anything? Do you want to take back the screen and just this live, or do you want to talk about it here?
We can just talk about it here. So this is something we've shared before, and we've continued after getting some feedback from a lot of our some of our users that we shared it with, some tweaks to it. This isn't just an Excel spreadsheet that you can take and make your own. You can modify it as you see fit, but we wanted to at least provide some initial a framework, right? So when you go to the Q factors tab on our tool, you're plugging in all these different adjustments, not a bunch of different Q factors for each different segment of the portfolio. And it can feel a little bit overwhelming if you're trying to get some sort of a framework for why you're making decisions about whether the extent and the amount of the adjustments. We thought this spreadsheet could help, provide that and help with that narrative, right, as to explaining it, because that's going to be a big piece of the puzzle ongoing is the justification or defense for all the adjustments that you've made to your historical experience for what you really expect going forward under CECL. So this just allows you to plug in different adjustments or change the ranges if you want to, and then make note of on a segment by segment basis whether you think there's less risk, similar risk, minimal, moderate, or significant more risk. And this is all relative to your historical experience, right? So when you're thinking about qualitative factor adjustments, the starting point is what was the historical experience? And these are all simply modifiers up or down from that historical experience. So certainly if you have a starting point, a historical experience of, 2% loss rate, what adjustment you're going to make to that would be different than if you have a starting point of a 5 basis point historical loss rate. So we want to think about it in that context. And this just provides a framework for you to start kind of scoring, more risk, similar risk, less risk, and then creating and using build-up method for those Q factor adjustments.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And again, we just trying to, try to provide a template to get you started, to give you a consistent base to manage from quarter to quarter. As Steve mentioned, you can certainly modify this. You could expand the boxes from 5 to 10 or whatever you.
We have some color coding in there for visuals,
Yeah.
and obviously if you change the ranges, then everything will recalculate, which is great. If you want to use different scores or you want to have more different score ranges, then obviously the conditional formatting we have in there, you'll have to tweak that or just kind of remove it because it's based upon working within this framework, but it's yours to use and tweak and play with as you see fit, if it's helpful.
And certainly too, a narrative surrounding this is always going to be helpful and beneficial, and in some cases, expected. So just a reminder on that. All right, so final chance to submit any questions in chat. Just a reminder, we will continue the coffee talks throughout 2023. I think the focus of these will change again more to continue to have questions, but I suspect as we get feedback and move forward, and again as we touched on, more confidence and comfortable with not only the standard but the tool, we expect questions on enhancements or just better questions around data availability or more things you can do with your data. Our presentations will evolve, but we will continue to be here on a monthly basis to kind of make sure we're working through any issues you might have. So our next session will be in January. We will have a CECLSolver demo for any of those who are just getting started. We'll have another call, and then we'll certainly hope to invite Paul back because, again, he's such a great guest and just very informational on a lot of the things that you'll be encountering as well. So, Paul, any final comments before we let everybody go today?
No, thanks for having me. Enjoyed the conversation and hope everyone relaxes and has a wonderful January.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Steve, any final comments before we let everybody go?
No, that's it for me today. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a happy holiday season. We'll see you in the new year and enjoy the weekend. Oh, a couple of questions came in. Let me take these real quick.
Just thanks.
Thank yous and Merry Christmas. All right. Thank you and Merry Christmas to everyone. Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2023. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend.